In the heart of the endless prairie, a lone woman clings to solitude and faith with only her Bible and dog for company. But when 6 strangers arrive with purpose and skill, her quiet life is forever changed. Witness trust, connection, and hope unfold across the vast western landscape. Subscribe and like to follow her story. For 13 years, the shack had stood isolated on the open prairie, a fragile structure of sun-bleached wood and tin that creaked under the persistent wind, its boards swollen and cracked from years of storms and drought. Sarah Holt, the woman who had claimed this lonely patch of earth, lived quietly with only 2 companions, a worn Bible, pages soft and dog-eared from decades of devotion, and a loyal hound named Gideon, whose dark eyes had witnessed her solitude since puppyhood. Her days were measured in the rhythm of Scripture, the rise and fall of the sun, and the occasional call of distant hawks that glided over the prairie with wings wide as the sky itself. She had no gate, no fence, no mark of protection beyond. The rough posts of the porch and the soft growl of Gideon when the horizon hinted at movement. That morning, a strange weight pressed into the golden haze of the sunrise. Plumes of dust rose far away, distinct yet strangely synchronized, the soft thrum of hooves reaching her ears before the figures were visible. 6 riders appeared on the trail, their silhouettes sharp against the orange and pale gold of dawn, moving with a steady, measured pace that suggested purpose rather than chance. Gideon growled low, muscles coiled, tail stiff, and Sarah's hand instinctively rested on the worn leather cover of her Bible. The riders drew nearer, their features still shadowed under wide-brimmed hats, dust clinging to boots and spurs. One figure, tall and broad-shouldered, led the small procession, carrying something across the saddle, not a rifle, not supplies, but rolled timber and rope, its meaning unclear. Sarah's breath tightened, her heartbeat syncing with the rhythmic thump of hooves on dry earth. She did not yet know why 6 men had come all this way, why the emptiness she had guarded so fiercely was about to be crossed, or what this sudden approach meant for the life she had painstakingly built. As the first rider slowed and nodded toward her, the weight of possibility pressed upon her chest. Would these men bring danger or something entirely unexpected? Who do you think these 6 men are? And why might they be bringing wood instead of weapons? The riders tied their horses with deliberate care, the ropes coiling around the posts and stakes as the soft morning light washed over the prairie. Sarah remained on the porch, her hands gripping the Bible tighter than ever, the pages creased under her fingers. Gideon moved to circle the newcomers, ears forward, sensing the measured rhythm in every movement of the men. They unpacked their timber, ropes, and tools with silent efficiency, each motion precise as if rehearsed 1,000 times. There was no hurry in their actions, no brashness of travelers merely passing through. Instead, there was intention, almost reverence, in how they placed each piece of wood on the sun-baked earth. Sarah's eyes followed every hammer, every saw, every notch being carved into the rough timber, a strange mix of suspicion and curiosity tightening her chest. The tallest rider approached her finally, a saw balanced against his shoulder, face shaded beneath his hat. "We thought this place could use a gate," he said simply, voice steady, almost reverent. His eyes didn't shift away from hers, carrying a weight of unspoken promise or warning. She said nothing, only let Gideon growl softly at his boots. The work began, hammer striking timber, saws slicing through thick planks, the sound echoing across the quiet prairie. Sarah had lived all these years without a gate, believing that the land itself would protect her, that solitude was her only shield. Yet now, seeing the men laboring under the rising sun, a strange warmth stirred in her chest. Perhaps this intrusion was more than mere coincidence. Perhaps this gate, crafted from their sweat and care, was not meant to imprison her, but to welcome something she had long denied herself: connection. As the first beams of morning touched the horizon, She realized that her quiet life on the prairie might never be the same again. The gate had begun to take shape, the rough-hewn planks slowly forming a frame that hinted at protection, order, and something unfamiliar in Sarah's life: permanence. The 6 men moved around it with quiet precision, each hammer strike ringing across the prairie, as if calling out to a world that had long ignored this solitary shack. Sarah observed from a few paces away, Bible tucked beneath one arm, while Gideon prowled near the timber piles, growling low at anything that stirred in the grass. She had expected suspicion, perhaps even aggression, but the men's work was silent devotion, an almost sacred ritual carried out in the harsh light of late morning. One of them, the youngest, wiped sweat from his brow and looked at her with a subtle smile, eyes glinting with curiosity and respect. Another knelt, measuring a crossbeam against the vertical posts, calling softly to the tallest rider for guidance. The sun climbed higher, warming the prairie, catching on the edges of the timber and on the sweat-darkened leather of boots and gloves. Sarah found herself inching closer, not to interfere, but to witness the transformation, the rhythm of their work syncing with the beating of her own heart. She realized how strange it was to watch strangers craft something intended for her, as if the earth itself had sanctioned their presence. Each strike of hammer against wood echoed in the hollow of her long solitude, and for the first time in over a decade, she felt the stirring of hope. Perhaps the world beyond her shack wasn't a threat. Perhaps it could be a gift. Gideon shifted beside her, tail wagging faintly, as if sensing the shift in her thoughts, the quiet promise of protection taking root not just in timber, but in her own chest. And as the day moved steadily forward, the prairie stretched endlessly. Around them, a vast arena for what was slowly becoming a small sanctuary, a gate that might mark the beginning of something entirely new in her life. By midday, the gate had begun to resemble something substantial, a structure that could stand against both time and storm, and Sarah found herself standing nearer than she had imagined she would. The men moved in quiet coordination, passing tools, and measuring timber with a rhythm that seemed almost rehearsed, their faces set with determination, yet softened by occasional glances at her presence. Gideon paced along the edge of the worksite, eyes following every movement, his low growls punctuating the pounding of hammers and the slicing of saws. The tallest rider, older and grizzled, instructed another in the placement of a heavy crossbeam, his voice calm yet commanding, each word measured to guide without hurry. Sarah watched the way their muscles flexed, the way dust clung to their sweat-darkened skin, and something stirred inside her, a fragile, hesitant curiosity mingled with the wariness she had carried for years. She realized the gate was more than wood. It was intent, care, and perhaps even respect poured into a labor that acknowledged her right to this land. The sun blazed overhead, making the freshly cut timber glint as if alive, and the prairie stretched endlessly, a golden sea that seemed to hold its breath as the work continued. Sarah shifted, Bible still clutched, feeling the weight of a moment. She could not have predicted strangers building something for her, and for the first time, the thought that she might not have to face the prairie alone again. Each hammer strike reverberated in her chest, echoing the pulse of a life she had kept quiet and contained, now shaking loose in the steady rhythm of 6 sets of hands shaping wood into protection, a promise, and maybe, if she dared, a bridge toward connection that had eluded her for so long. The sun hung high and harsh over the prairie as the 6 men worked with tireless focus, hammering the last boards into place, measuring each plank against the posts, and fitting the final hinges that would give the gate its weight and purpose. Sarah stood a few steps back, the Bible pressed against her chest, Gideon resting one paw against her leg, alert but calm. The scent of sawdust and hot timber filled the air, mixing with the sharp tang of sweat and the earthy aroma of the prairie. Each man moved with practiced precision, coordinating without words, yet glancing occasionally toward her as if acknowledging her presence, and her silent permission to witness the transformation. The tallest rider adjusted a crossbeam, squinting against the sun, while the youngest smoothed the plank into place, wiping his hands on his worn trousers. For all her years of solitude, Sarah had never imagined watching such care given to something that belonged solely to her. The half-finished gate loomed like a promise, an assertion that her little shack and the land around it mattered enough for others to bend their strength toward it. And as the final plank was aligned, the hinges tightened, and the structure began to take its full shape. She felt a stirring in her chest, a mixture of awe, gratitude, and an unfamiliar sense of hope. Gideon barked once, softly, as if approving the work, and Sarah realized that the gate was more than timber. It was a shield, a threshold, and an invitation, a tangible reminder that even in the vast, lonely prairie, connection could be forged. Through effort, respect, and unspoken understanding. The wind swept across the golden grass, rustling the gate and carrying the faintest scent of change, and Sarah understood that the life she had known alone was shifting, its boundaries expanding, in ways she had not dared to dream. The gate was finally complete, solid and proud, standing between the open prairie and the small shack that had been Sarah's solitary kingdom for over a decade. She approached it cautiously, her fingers brushing the smooth, roughened wood, tracing the faint hammer marks left by the 6 men who had devoted hours of sweat and skill to its construction. Gideon padded close, tail wagging gently, as if sensing that something monumental had just occurred. The 6 men lingered a few paces away, leaning on their tools, wiping grime and sweat from their brows, exchanging quiet nods and half-smiles, each acknowledging the unspoken bond that had formed between them through labor and purpose. Sarah realized she had never felt so seen, not in town, not in years of solitude. This simple structure, a gate, bore the weight of attention and care. That made her chest ache with gratitude. The prairie stretched before them, golden waves of grass shifting with the afternoon wind, and she felt the expanse of land both frightening and inviting, no longer entirely hers alone, yet somehow more hers than ever. One of the men, the youngest, approached with a small, crooked smile, brushing dust from his hands, and met her eyes. For the first time in years, she wondered not about survival, but about trust, about the possibility that connection could exist beyond necessity, beyond loneliness, in the quiet exchange of respect and effort. As the shadows lengthened across the prairie and the sun sank lower, Sarah found herself leaning lightly against the gate, Gideon at her feet, feeling the steady rhythm of life pulse in the dust, in the wind, and in the presence of strangers who had become allies in the shaping of her world. Evening draped itself over the prairie, the long shadows stretching like silent witnesses across the freshly finished gate. Sarah stood near the structure, her Bible held loosely in one hand, while Gideon lay in the shadow beneath the wood, ears flicking at each movement. The 6 men had set down their tools, some leaning against the gate, others stretching tired muscles from hours of labor. Their faces, dust-streaked and sunburned, bore quiet satisfaction, a contrast to the deep fatigue of their limbs. Sarah felt an unfamiliar warmth in her chest, a mixture of relief and cautious curiosity, as she observed the subtle interplay of camaraderie and respect between the men. Each glance they cast her way carried no expectation, no demand, only acknowledgement of her presence and silent gratitude for the opportunity to contribute to something meaningful. She traced the hinges with her fingertips, imagining the gate swinging open and closed, marking not only the boundary of her property but also the beginning of something she hadn't dared to imagine in years, a connection with the world beyond. Her shack, a bridge forged through trust and shared effort. The prairie around them whispered in the evening breeze, a gentle accompaniment to the soft murmur of conversation among the men, their laughter low but genuine, breaking the solemnity of the day. And in that moment, leaning against the sturdy, timber, Sarah realized that solitude, though comforting, could also be transformed by small acts of kindness, by labor shared in silence, by the presence of others who recognized the value in both the land and the woman who called it home. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, spilling golden light across the prairie, Sarah approached the gate for the first time with an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. Her hand rested on the rough wood, fingers brushing the marks left by hammer. And she pushed gently. The gate swung open with a creak that sounded almost like a sigh, echoing faintly across the vast emptiness. Gideon shot forward into the open prairie, tail high, barking at the wind as if announcing the new boundary of their world. The 6 men stood a few paces back, their faces illuminated by the fading light, eyes glinting with quiet pride and satisfaction. One of them, the oldest, nodded toward her, a subtle acknowledgement that this act of construction had become a shared achievement. Not just their labor, but her acceptance of it as well. Sarah stepped through the gate, the soft soil crunching beneath her boots, and realized how strange it felt to move through a space that had once belonged entirely to solitude, but now carried the weight of connection and care. The warm breeze carried the faint scent of timber and dust, mingling with the earthy smell of the prairie, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine that life could hold more than endurance. It could hold trust, hope, and perhaps even friendship. The men began to gather their tools, preparing to leave, but there was no rush, no urgency, only the shared silence of understanding that something had shifted. The prairie, endless and golden, seemed to breathe with her, stretching open before them as if welcoming a new chapter that Sarah was only beginning to recognize. And in that moment, she understood that the gate was more than a barrier. It was an invitation, a threshold between the world she had known and the life that might finally include others without fear or solitude. Twilight settled over the prairie, casting the world in a soft palette of purples and golds. The edges of the landscape blurred in the dimming light. Sarah lit a small lantern near the doorway of her shack, its flickering glow painting gentle shadows on the worn wood and illuminating Gideon's attentive face as he curled at her feet. The 6 men gathered nearby, sitting on fallen logs and leaning against their saddles, voices low and steady, sharing stories that seemed to belong to the wind and the dust more than any town or home. Sarah listened, her Bible resting in her lap, eyes scanning the horizon that stretched endlessly beyond the newly built gate. The gate itself, now fully realized, seemed to stand as a sentinel against solitude, its hinges glinting faintly in the lantern light, a testament to hours of effort and silent dedication. Every so often, a horse shuffled or whinnied softly, dust lifting from the dry ground in tiny puffs, and the men would nod to one another, acknowledging the quiet presence of her life within the shack. For the first time, Sarah felt the prairie, less like a prison and more like a living space, a place where the human connection she had denied herself could exist alongside the land she had cherished for so long. The oldest rider reached out to adjust a loose strap on his saddle, glancing at her with a faint, unspoken invitation, a recognition that the world she had kept at bay could now enter her life without fear. And as the sky deepened to indigo, the lantern light reflecting in the dog's watchful eyes, Sarah realized that the gate had not only transformed the boundary of her land, but had also begun to open the boundary of her heart, allowing trust, gratitude, and the fragile stirrings of companionship to take root where once only isolation had grown. Morning arrived with a quiet majesty, the golden sun spilling across the prairie and illuminating the fully completed gate that now stood as both protector and invitation. Sarah stepped through the threshold, her Bible clutched loosely in one hand, the other brushing Gideon's fur as he darted forward into the open grass, tail wagging in pure joy. The 6 men lingered nearby, their tools set aside, faces marked with dust and sweat, but softened by contentment and pride. They had come as strangers, intent perhaps on nothing more than work or wandering. Yet through their effort and shared purpose, they had left behind something enduring, a structure and a gesture that carried weight far beyond its timber. Sarah felt the prairie breathe around her, the wind lifting her hair and carrying the scent of sawdust, dust, and earth. She realized as the men watched quietly from the shadows of the rising sun that her life of solitude had been transformed not by intrusion but by care, skill, and quiet respect. The gate marked a threshold not just of property but of heart, a crossing into a world where connection could exist alongside independence, and where trust, hope, and companionship were not only possible but tangible. Gideon barked once, leaping forward as if to declare the freedom of the open land and the bonds now woven into it. Sarah turned to the men, her lips curling in the faintest of smiles, and for the first time in over a decade, she felt that life might hold more than survival. It might hold community, laughter, and even joy. And as the sun climbed higher, washing the prairie in a brilliance that made every shadow seem a memory of the past, she knew that the gate was more than wood and nails. It was the beginning of a new chapter, a testament to the courage of letting others in, and the beauty of what can be built when care and intention meet solitude and need.